Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on queer and trans Latinidades. One of the terms for this week is gender, and the reading talks about how gender is discussed within Latinx studies. So the study of gender has challenged the male-female binary and the taken for granted assumptions about gender roles and characteristics. Questions of gender raise questions about what it means to be a woman or a man, and sort of not taking for granted what those things mean. Gender studies illustrates how gender assumptions have been socially constructed. So, for example, the whole idea of girls wearing pink and boys wearing blue is something that was actually created in the 1950s, even though we kind of assume that it's always been that way. Latinx studies broaden studies of gender by asking how does race and ethnicity, class, etc., impact the experiences of gender. Latinx studies has joined studies of gender that have broadened gender categories to include trans and non-binary gender identities as well. The other term for this week is sexuality. Sexuality refers to identities based on sexual practices and romantic desires. Sexuality refers to multiple forms of sexual practices and desires, including heterosexual, pansexual, bisexual, and homosexual. Latinx studies has studied the ways in which Latinx sexuality is often perceived and represented as deviant, hypersexual, a threat, in other words, as a racialized type of sexuality. Latinx studies of sexuality aim to include the experiences of LGBTQ Latinxes. Finally, Latinx studies of sexuality also aim to study how all forms of sexuality are experienced within Latinx communities and how culture impacts sexuality. And so this is when we sometimes hear the word sexuality, we assume we're talking only about LGBTQ plus people. But the study of sexuality is also studying heterosexuality, right? What are the things we take for granted in terms of heterosexuality? What are the taboos around sexuality, especially within Latinx communities, for example? These would be examples of the kinds of things that Latinx studies does or looks at in relationship to sexuality. The reading also mentioned how one of the issues that Latinx studies addresses when talking about sexuality are the representations of Latinx sexuality. And the reading talks about the images of Latina women, for example, as spitfires, whores, virgins, maids, while images of Latino men are of criminals or villains, gangbangers, drug lord, depicted in Westerns as silent and lazy, part of the backdrop of the white Western hero, or as the quote-unquote Latin lovers. So as you see, a lot of the ways in which Latinos are represented, particularly in movies and the media and so on, are often in relation to a certain idea about their sexuality as well. One of the other articles also focused on Silvia Rivera, who was a trans Latinx activist who participated in the Stonewall Rebellion. And if you're not familiar with the Stonewall Rebellion, this was the incident that took place in the late 60s that in New York City that kind of kicked off the LGBTQ movement. And so often the histories of this event erase the fact that Latinx and African-American trans folks were part of that incident as well. So in the reading, it discusses how at a very young age, Sylvia was left without a family. The father left, the mother committed suicide, and the grandmother tried to beat his differences out of him. The grandmother also rejected him racially because he looked darker like his Puerto Rican father, and the grandmother had wanted a white child. Sylvia runs away from home at the age of 10 and joins the street drag queens who adopted her as a child and taught her how to hustle for money. The Gay Liberation Front and gay activist alliances, which were formed in New York as a result of the Stonewall Rebellion. However, when Sylvia tried to participate in the activism of these organizations, she was consistently rejected as quote-unquote a troublemaker that they were all afraid of. In 1970, Rivera worked to pass a gay rights bill that included protections for gender variant people, But gay activists did backroom deals with politicians, which agreed to pass the bill if they excluded trans people. In the article, it talks about how she carves out a space for herself where she can exist as herself with her partner and her friends who accept her for who she is. She doesn't want to be part of any labels, including the label transgender. So the legacy of Silvia Rivera continues to this day, where there's a Silvia Rivera Law Center in New York that focuses on the rights of trans people in the United States. And she has, in more recent years, become a focus of study by Latinx